Welcome back to The Compass. We're recording this episode March 31st, 2025, end of Q1. So certainly some interesting things on the horizon as Q2 reporting starts in a few weeks. With me, as always, is Sam Pelaez, President, CEO, and CIO of Olive Resource Capital, and I'm Derek Macpherson, the Executive Chair of Olive. Today, I'm going to delve into a topic that became a little more topical last week with President Trump's signing of the mineral production order in the U.S., which is kind of resource nationalism / political risk / I don't know where you want to be. I think the key thing is that whenever you're looking at a mining investment, and this is probably the important aspect of this, the one thing is absolutely certain: you can't move the rocks. The rocks are exactly where they are, and you have to mine them there first and foremost. And so how that jurisdiction is going to treat you from a permitting perspective, how the local community thinks about that project, all of those things are very critical for whether that project or that drill hole or that resource is actually something that could be converted into being something economic. And so it's something that, we evaluate with every investment that we do.
I think can't understate how important this topic is when evaluating a company. I think most people stop at the political risk.
Nope.
Western Europe, the Americas, part of the Americas, Australia, and just assess it from a political view. But like you said, it transcends that, and perhaps even more important is the formulation of the regulations around permitting, both environmental, but the other associated permits that go with that. And, and practically the trigger for this episode and our conversation is Donald Trump signing this executive order to, it's still hard to tell because not all the details are out, but effectively try to normalize or bring down sort of like the cost for companies and the timeline of getting permitted so that they can actually go into what they're supposed to do, which is to produce these minerals.
If we were ranking jurisdictions and we were, if we said, okay, what's the best jurisdiction in the world? If you had to pick a place to put your deposit, sort of the exact opposite of the way the world actually works, we would probably, you and I would pick Western Australia from a jurisdiction point of view. Mining country, rule of law, so tier one from a rule of law perspective or economic perspective, and has a reasonable permitting timeline. You can actually get mines built in Western Australia in a reasonable amount of time. Not super fast, not West Africa fast or how Mexico used to be, but certainly one of the fastest permitting timelines in a tier one jurisdiction. And so I think that when you look at, if you were looking at sort of Western jurisdictions and calling Western Australia Western jurisdiction is not geographically correct, but it is from a rule of law perspective. If you look at like Canada or the US, Europe, so like Finland is an area that we have investments. If you look at those areas, and portions of Latin America, not all of Latin America, we consider to be tier one from a rule of law perspective. If you look at those countries and you go, what's the biggest risk that differentiates those countries? It's permitting timeline, right? Whereas you might be, from when you start permitting to finish permitting, you might be 4 to 5 years in Canada. You're probably 1 to 2 in Western Australia. Whereas the US, you could be 5 to 10. I mean, when I started in the business 15 years ago, they were trying to permit Rosemont, which is a copper asset. It's a copper project in Arizona. Still doesn't have its permits. That may change now. So I think that Mineral Production Act bodes well for the U.S. But I think maybe before we get into the specifics and what's changing, do you want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about permitting timelines and rule of law. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about rule of law and how we view that as important for different countries?
Yeah, so I think, now it looks like we're segmenting this into two parts, rule of law and permitting timelines. Rule of law is binary. You either have a reasonable rule of law standard or you don't. The the experience that some of the Canadian miners had in Mali last year is pretty scary. Some rules of the game were changed in a coercive fashion. That's a difficult place for new business to happen from a Canadian perspective. I don't expect a lot of companies to be at this point looking to advance projects in those jurisdictions. And that's where I'm saying binary. At this point, if you come to us to propose a new build in Mali, you're probably going to wait it out and see what happens. It's not the immediate call to action. Whereas I think the permitting timelines, and before we go back to that, but the permitting timelines, there are more shades of gray. And I think that's where you can get, it's not binary. There are some jurisdictions that give you more comfort than others. And I think back to the original case, I think this is why this episode and this Trump directive could be very powerful.
I think so, but I think just so let's focus on the rule of law for a second, and then we'll talk about permitting timelines, and then we'll sort of bundle it up with a what we own or what we're looking at that kind of fits that theme. I think the rule of law thing is it is binary, but it is binary until it isn't. It's a good rule of law jurisdiction. In the last gold cycle, and this is going back to 2011, 2012, 2013, Mali was the place to go. Mali, Burkina Faso, other destinations in West Africa. It was a new frontier. People were chasing ounces out there. And we saw mines built and mines built in short periods of time. And that in the last 2 or 3 years has really, a little bit more, a little longer than that, but has really changed, right? Burkina Faso, not that I think it was a democratic country, but it's not democratic now. You've got, and you have risks with there. We haven't seen it with any sort of the high profile that's happened in Mali, but I think certainly a possibility. So you have jurisdictions that were once considered good jurisdictions are now not. Panama is another great example. What happened with Cobre Panama. That's a little bit different because Cobre Panama represented so much of GDP of that country that it's a strategically significant asset, whereas some of these gold mines in Mali and Burkina Faso aren't quite at that scale. But I remember when Bolivia nationalized an asset out of a company used to be called South American Silver in 2011, right? Ecuador ground permitting to a halt for Fruta del Norte, which obviously now with Inlandine Gold is an amazing asset, and with a different group of people, they were able to move ahead. So, and probably a different approach to the government, but the government materially changed there, and so that's the other part. Rule of law is kind of it's a big thing, but generally as a foreign company, often you don't have recourse, or you don't have recourse in a short period of time, and so it becomes very difficult. Then all of a sudden, the royalty rules can change or the permitting rules can change. And I think that's part of it as well. What you want as an investor, what we're looking for in a jurisdiction is stability. We want things to stay the same. And that's, and that's why we don't have a lot of investments in Mexico. We don't have any investments in Mexico now, if I think about it. And well, I guess we do, but very few, and certainly nothing in the development stage. And part of that is related directly to the instability of the mining law there. You used to be able to permit something in 6 months in Mexico, and now you're in a situation where it's actually very uncertain, right? So how things are going to proceed.
Well, there are countries or provinces, depending on how you look at it, that use mining law as a political tool for elections, as the case in Mexico. You don't hear in Quebec talking about changing the permitting or mining law. So those places certainly make you feel safer because there's greater continuity of the policy past the election cycles. It's very typical. Latin America, typically, lots of talk about mining law in elections. So, lesser confidence in those countries. But one point that I do want to make, and to your point about how things can change, is that in this is an element where you're never truly 100% safe, right? You can never pick a jurisdiction and be certain that forever and ever you're going to have everything working out in your favor. Case in point, Panama, which negotiated a deal with Cobre Panama twice, Second time around, it was supposed to be definitive, and that's the one that actually got struck down, right? Conversely, there are places that may not have been good a while back, and are starting to make a comeback, or just generally where mining wasn't a big thing, and then it started to become a big thing. Like think about Marion when Newman built that in Suriname, right? You only had Roosevelt at the time that had been there for a long time. They made the conditions favorable, and now that's a spectacular asset within the Newman portfolio.
Yeah, and that leads to exploration success in that area. That's where Founders is based, and Greenheart also has assets there. So you're creating a lot of value because that jurisdiction has changed. And we saw the same thing when Ecuador opened up, right? When Lundin Gold was able to finally get a reasonable sort of economic split on the mining law, all of a sudden there was lots of exploration dollars that got poured into Ecuador, which was a prospective country. And if you got the timing right, I mean, you could have made a lot of money on things like Sol Gold, or there's a couple other companies in there where they really moved, and because all of a sudden there was that change. So
this one also reminds me of Colombia, when I want to say it's already more than 10 years ago. They did a moratorium on mining licenses, and then people thought that would translate into new people who had mining licenses wouldn't get permits to build. But then they created a special framework for significant projects where Continental Gold's Buritica came under. So it got taken from a provincial state level to the national level, where all the permits and the entire project evaluation would be done at the national level. And then that was, it all happened very fast. And they went through the stages and got the permit. And obviously that mine got built, and it's operated by Zijin now. And, back then it was a great success, from the uncertainty and the permitting to the point where the company got the permit and eventually got sold. So, things can change for the better.
Right. And probably, arguably Colombia is one of those jurisdictions, and there's some, and Latin America is actually particularly known for this, is that, and Colombia is one of those jurisdictions, Ecuador is, Bolivia has had its hot and cold periods where you have, depending on the government that's in, you have a mining is favorable or less favorable. The one thing you always have to remember, unless you are at the stage where you're applying for your permits, generally speaking, like if you're looking at an exploration project in Colombia right now, Colombia, we would argue, is probably a less favorable jurisdiction for new mining projects. But if you have an exploration stage project in Colombia right now, i.e., say Collective Mining, which is a bit of great exploration success, you're probably far enough away from permits or needing permits that the current government doesn't matter, right? And, you will have a new government by the time those permits come around. Similarly, also in Colombia, if you look at Aris Gold, right, they already have their permits in hand and they're building. And so the government changing and being weaker, unless the government steps in and stops the permits or stops the construction, isn't an issue. And it's very rare that governments, what we saw with Cobre Panama and what we saw with Cobre Panama is very rare, where governments flip on a dime and say, we told you could build this, and we told you these are the economic conditions, and we're changing that midstream. It doesn't, and that's what we're seeing in West Africa, which is why people are concerned about it. It's a little bit of what we're seeing in Mexico. Not that they're impairing existing projects. We own a little bit of we own some Mag Silver, which is obviously an operating mine. But they've changed the rules around permitting, which all of a sudden, and not really changed the rules, they've actually just created uncertainty, and that's the issue. That I get that makes the jurisdiction less attractive.
I think we should let's talk about like the constructive parts that we're seeing right now, which is obviously this U.S. momentum, let's call it, which clearly started before this executive order, which is previous comments and the Ambler Access Road? I forget the name in Alaska.
Yeah, it's the Ambler Access Road is what it's called. But for for Trilogy / South 32's massive VMS project up there.
Right. And isn't there there's forget the name. Rick Van Nieuwhouse's
there's
also benefits
Valhalla
from
that's
that
on
road.
that will benefit.
Valhalla,
The smaller
yeah.
company will benefit from that road
Right.
as well.
Beyond the the complexities of different countries, their electoral processes, and how this could be used as a bargaining tool, there are specific places where the governments are currently in favor and working towards advancing and fast forwarding development of the entire resource extraction industry. So let's start with the U.S., which is the most obvious one and most relevant based on the news from last week. And what do you know about this specific? The details are never fully there with this administration, but what what does this mean for a development stage project that was looking for permits?
In principle, it means it's going to come faster. That at the end of the day. Now, the rules aren't all the way down to the, as some of our viewers will know, I'm also the chairman of a U.S. Explorco, right? West Point Gold, which has a project that's been in drill permitting for 4 years. At that level, where we are in that process, where we haven't seen any material changes yet as far as process goes, but those things are going to change, and they're talking about change at the operational level, I guess, for lack of a better description. And so I expect to see this change to flow through. So if you've got a project that's at the edge of permitting, now's the time to get it permitted, right? We saw, obviously the Ambler Access Road we just talked about is back on. You have used to be called Midas Gold, now it's called Perpetua Resources, but the Stibnite project in Idaho got, after being in permitting for 10 or 15 years, has actually got its permits. It's a little bit related to the antimony more so than the the gold or the economic benefit, but it got permits. And I think that you're going to see, I think that what we're going to see, and we've already seen companies sort of react to it, right? So, you've got Mako Mining they bought out of bankruptcy and got a great deal, but they bought the Moss Mine, formerly Elevation Gold or Northern Vertex, and they bought that and moved into the U.S. and they had assets in Nicaragua and Guyana. Even though it's a U.S. based team, it was a change of direction for them, and they moved into the U.S. because they think, it's kind of that there's a 4-year window here where you could strike where the iron's hot as a corporation. Same thing with Minera Alamos, a company that had been really, really focused in Mexico for a very long time, and now are, have again shifted, have acquired a U.S. asset. And part of that was the uncertainty in Mexico, but also the changing landscape in the changing landscape in the U.S. So I think you're going to see, other than I think you're going to see, generally speaking, a lot of these projects that are at, another company we own, Sailfish Royalties, right? They have a big royalty on the Spring Valley project, which is privately held, but is going through the permitting process. You have confidence that those things are going, based on this executive order, you got to assume that these things are going to get permitted. And I think that's an opportunity for investors, because I don't think a lot of the stocks have reacted to it.
And not just in our industry,
except for Trilogy and South 32. That one moved as soon as Trump got elected.
Yeah, no, and the Pebble project that comes and goes in the market, that's also starting to move based on speculation that something could happen there. We've talked about this one, but the market still wants to see what happens with it.
I would very hesitant. Yes, they're a U.S. project. It's one of the biggest copper gold deposits out there. The main pushback against it is actually the I guess the game
salmon fishing industry, right?
Salmon. It's not the traditional, like the commercial salmon fishing industry. It's the teams. That's the hunting camps and fishing lodges and stuff that are all downstream of that potentially downstream of that that are the pushback. And Donald Trump Jr. has been out publicly against it. So I would be shocked if that one got permitted, but never say never if they do the work properly. But yeah, there's lots of companies
and obviously
out
And obviously, all the there's a number of projects in Arizona that are in or at or near the permitting phase that will certainly benefit from streamlined or faster type of processing for this permits. So, like in any type of investing, this is no different. Like wherever there is a regulatory softening, that's typically favorable for the companies and their valuation. So we expect that you know beyond the initial speculation and rise in the stock prices, this story should do well.
But I think you've got to be, from an investment point of view, if you're, if I was giving advice to corporations, if you got a project that's close to permitting, you should be going after permitting. You don't need a feasibility study to permit in the U.S. You just need an engineered mine plan, right? Very different things than from a data production point of view. If you're
I think just this morning, Revival Gold put out its first technical study.
on the
So to your point,
on the new project on the new project, Well, and I think you're gonna.
So to your point, like this is the right window.
This is you're gonna get a bit of a I am speaking my book a little bit here, but like this is something we actually believe at West Point, is that there's going to be a renaissance in U.S. mining, and so if you're going to get a renaissance in U.S. mining, now's the time to be there. But also, there's 3.5 years until there's a new president. So if there's 3.5 years till there's a new president, potentially a new administration, you would need to have, you need to get to work, I guess, if you will. Both the government needs to get to work and take those high level orders and push them down onto the actual regulators. But then also, as a company, you need to get your house in order so that you're ready to apply and get through what is supposed to be an expedited process in the next 3.5 years. So
where else in the world are there favorable tailwinds in terms of regulation and permitting?
I mean, again, back to my book, one of the ones that are our book is Omai, right? Very unique there in Guyana. Again, full disclosure, I'm a director. It's our largest mining position by far. So, we have a favorable view, but Guyana has fundamentally changed with the, in the last 3 years with the oil discovery and the cash coming. You're seeing major infrastructure projects go into that country. So it's making it easier to go mining, I guess, for lack of a better description. But the second part is that you have a government that now has significant cash flow, but not a lot of jobs. Offshore oil and gas doesn't produce a lot of jobs locally. They're going through a building phase now, but eventually they need, they want long-term stable employment. And so there's a big, wisely on their side, there's a big push for them to either jobs, that are sort of secondary to the oil and gas industry where they can, have cheap energy and do things that way, and mining. And at Omai, the government is trying to do everything they can to help us build that project as quickly as possible. And I think that's not something, and they want it built yesterday, right? We can only advance it as fast as capital and geology and engineering will allow us. But that's something that is very, very different from a lot of jurisdictions. This isn't a jurisdiction that's throwing up hurdles. It's a jurisdiction that's like, can we build this? How fast can you build this type attitude, which is, very different.
On our book as well, we have some exposure in Brazil to a company called Bravo. And there were some questions about whether they would get their initial sort of preliminary permits. And, not record time, but, pretty expedient process. They came to PDAC this year to announce that they had received their preliminary permits, which obviously moves forward the project from an exploration project to now officially, legally, a development stage project. So, there are other jurisdictions that are also starting to work together with the companies to try to facilitate their lives where possible, and especially the ones that have reputation for being good corporate citizens and having done the entire process the right way. I think countries are starting to take note and making sure that these companies get all their permits as quickly as humanly and legally possible.
I think that the other jurisdiction, and we don't have any exposure there, but it's something that is probably important, is Argentina. So Argentina is sort of ahead of the curve as far as the U.S. goes, right? They, Melee went in there and has made some major changes and has now really made an attractive resource industry. Tried to make it more attractive for the resource industry because he knows he's got natural resources. I've always been hesitant in Argentina because I live, I'm old enough to remember, when Argentina was not the place to be. It was the exact opposite. And so I think that there's opportunity there. Argentina, you have to be very careful because also there, the individual states have the permitting, generally have the final say on a project. So it's not all cut and dried. Everything in Argentina is not good. Make sure you understand exactly where you are. But I think, the other thing is, and I think this is an important one, and it feeds back into Bravo, what you were saying, though. I think the other thing that makes it important is when you look at a jurisdiction is you want your management team or people within that management team of the company to have experience in that jurisdiction and move projects ahead. It is, and I think that's something that Bravo benefits from immensely. And so I think anytime you look at these, it's different. You can always hire that expertise, but it's different when you have it in-house. I think that makes a big difference. Just looking at the time here, I guess maybe wind it up with a few picks on sort of the resource nationalism or East versus West, or however you want to look at it, theme where we've got investments that we think kind of fit this theme. Sam, you want to go first? We mentioned a few of them already, but
I sort of want to mention like places that when I see projects, I react favorably, which is Quebec and Ontario for the most part. Known regulatory frameworks, lots of activity, lots of reference points to check upon. I generally like Brazil as a mining jurisdiction in general. There's the occasional electoral related complication, but if you look at it over the long haul, like projects in Brazil typically get built, and obviously, like like you mentioned, like Western Australia is like heaven for miners in so many ways. Not just regulatory, just in general, the ease of doing business in that province, and it's quite special.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain jurisdictions where you just go, yeah, okay, that's interesting to me. Like in the U.S. to some extent is that way too, right? It's like a project in Nevada. Okay, yeah, it's a good project in Nevada. It's generally has got you have a favorable view. You start with a favorable view on it. I guess thinking of that theme, some of the names that we really like that kind of fit this resource nationalism theme, I think probably on the Nevada theme is Anglo Gold. They've got probably one of the most significant discoveries made by a major in the last probably 20 years at least, that they're drilling off and developing. I think that's something that's going to benefit from the current administration. I think they're smart enough to race this thing through permitting as quickly as they can. So I think that's one where we like it. It's kind of, even though they've grown inorganically via M&A, it's certainly, they have a situation where they're going to have significant organic growth in a tier 1 jurisdiction coming down the pipeline.
U.S., the better parts of Canada, almost all of Australia, with certain exceptions. And I think in Africa, there are some, obviously Namibia is a fantastic jurisdiction for mining. Zambia, a little bit here and there, depends on the project, but typically, Barrick, First Quantum, lots of sort of like known miners from this part of the world have been successful there. Oh, and we've actually missed one that's come along recently, Morocco.
Right. Yeah.
What Benoit Lazal and his group have done at Aya has been spectacular. Like from 2020 to 2024, 4 years, they've pretty much transformed country that nobody had in its radar to 1.5, call it one mine in operation, the other one in development, and a new Spinco that's presumably also on track to get permits. So, a newcomer let's say, to our industry. So with favorable regimes and realistic timelines, we welcome all of them.
But I think that theme of resource nationalism, particularly when it comes to, we talked a lot about gold names because gold's hot. I mean, as we're recording this, gold's over 3,100 or was over 3,100 when we started. We talked a lot about gold names, but I think this resource nationalism theme, that West versus East concept, is definitely going to play through for things like rare earths, copper, elements that right now China has full control over, right? So, examples, Arizona Sonoran in our portfolio, we own it because of that. Platinum Palladium is another one. We have Bravo, which is in Brazil, and Chalice, which is which is in Western Australia. And so I think that some of those themes continue to play out as well. And so I think that there's, I guess the concluding or motherhood statement that goes with this is like, we prefer and we chase good jurisdictions, but we are very conscious of how jurisdictions can change, right? Right now, we like the U.S. and we want to be there, but in 3.5 years, if there's a significant change in government, then that could really get walked back a lot, right? Same thing in same Latin America. I want to say this the right way, but like, and I might come out wrong, but like Latin America is definitely one of those countries is as a group, and generally speaking, even the best countries, right? Like Mexico forever was the best country to go mining in. Brazil was, Colombia's been considered a good one. Chile, those countries, all of a sudden you can have this change of government. And it matters a little bit for producers. Generally speaking, like I said, you don't see things like what happened to Cobre Panama, that those are part of black swan events. But where it really affects companies is developers or taxes. And so those are the two things that you always got to be cognizant of as governments change. So I think with that, I think we've talked about enough names and places that we like and places that we don't, and where I guess kind of where we're putting our money. So until next week, thanks very much.